For 7 years, Samuel heard everything. Every cruel word, every whispered plan, every secret the masters thought was safe to speak in front of him. But he never flinched, never reacted, never gave any sign that sound reached his ears. Because his silence was his greatest weapon. His invisibility his shield, and his patience the key to the freedom he meticulously planned with every passing day. If you believe in the power of human resilience, strategic brilliance, and the unbreakable spirit of those who fought for their freedom through intelligence and extraordinary patience, please subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell to follow more stories like this one. These are the voices that changed history, and they deserve to be heard. Samuel was 23 years old when he made the decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. He had been enslaved on the Caldwell plantation in South Carolina since birth, the son of a woman named Grace, who had died when he was 12, leaving him with memories of her songs and her whispered warnings to be smart, to be careful, to survive by any means necessary. His father was unknown, possibly one of the enslaved men from a neighboring plantation, possibly the overseer who had taken liberties his mother never spoke about. Samuel had learned early that asking questions about such things only brought pain. The Caldwell plantation was not the largest in the region, but it was prosperous, built on the forced labor of 32 enslaved people who worked from dawn until well past dusk in the cotton fields, in the house, in the stables, in the workshops. Master Richard Caldwell was a man of 45, educated in Charleston, well-spoken and refined in public, and casually brutal in private. He considered himself a benevolent slave owner, which meant he provided adequate food and didn't whip without reason, though his definition of reason was broad and ever-changing. Samuel had always been observant, always been intelligent, though he had learned to hide both qualities behind a mask of simplicity. Enslaved people who appeared too smart made white people nervous, and nervous white people were dangerous. So Samuel had perfected the art of seeming simple-minded, of nodding along, of doing his work competently but not exceptionally, of blending into the background of plantation life. Everything changed on a humid August morning in 1847. Samuel was working in the tobacco barn, hanging leaves to dry, when he overheard Master Caldwell speaking with his brother, Thomas, who was visiting from Georgia. They stood just outside the barn door, assuming they were alone, assuming the slave working inside was too far away to hear clearly. But Samuel had positioned himself strategically, and their voices carried perfectly to where he stood. "I'm telling you, Richard, the abolitionists are getting bolder. They've got networks all through the South now, helping niggers escape. You need to be more careful about what you say around them. They understand more than you think," Thomas said, his voice low but urgent. Richard laughed dismissively. "You worry too much, brother. These creatures aren't capable of that kind of strategic thinking. They're like children, really. I can say anything in front of them and it doesn't matter. They forget it immediately." Samuel's hands continued their work, but his mind was racing. In that moment, listening to men who considered themselves superior discuss how much enslaved people understood, he realized something profound. They were terrified of black intelligence. They had to believe enslaved people were incapable of complex thought, because if they acknowledged the truth, the entire system would be revealed as the monstrous injustice it was. And then the idea came to him, crystalline and complete. What if he made himself even more invisible? What if he took away one of the primary ways humans communicated and gathered information? What if he pretended to be deaf? The risk was enormous. If he was discovered, the punishment would be severe. Master Caldwell did not tolerate deception from his slaves, and pretending to have a disability could be seen as mockery, or worse, as an attempt to avoid work. But the potential rewards were equally enormous. If they believed he was deaf, they would speak freely around him. He would learn things no enslaved person was supposed to know. He might gather information that could lead to escape, to freedom, to the life his mother had dreamed he might one day live. That night, lying on his thin mattress in the quarters, Samuel made his decision. He would become deaf. Not gradually, which might seem suspicious, but suddenly, as if from illness or injury. He would have to be convincing, absolutely convincing, because one slip, one moment of reaction to sound, and everything would be lost. The next morning, Samuel began his performance. When the wake-up bell rang, he didn't stir. His bunkmate, a young man named Isaiah, shook him awake, confused. Samuel sat up slowly, rubbing his head, looking disoriented. When Isaiah spoke to him, Samuel just stared, his face blank. Isaiah spoke louder, then louder still, and Samuel gave no indication of hearing. "Something's wrong with Samuel," Isaiah said to the others gathered in the cabin. "He can't hear nothing." Word spread quickly. By breakfast, the overseer, a rough man named Clyde Morrison, was bellowing in Samuel's face, testing whether the deafness was real. Samuel stood perfectly still, his eyes focused on Morrison's lips, mimicking what he had seen a truly deaf man do years ago, but showing no response to the volume or the fury. Morrison slapped him hard across the face, and Samuel's head snapped to the side, but he didn't cry out, didn't react to the verbal abuse that accompanied the blow, only to the physical sensation. Master Caldwell was summoned. He examined Samuel with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting livestock. He clapped his hands next to Samuel's ears, shouted, even fired a pistol into the air a few feet away. Samuel had prepared himself for this moment, had steeled every nerve in his body, and he didn't flinch. The pistol shot was the hardest test. Every instinct screamed at him to react, to cover his ears, to show the natural human response to sudden, loud noise. But he remained still, turning his head only after the sound had faded, as if sensing movement or vibration but not sound itself. "Well, I'll be damned," Master Caldwell said, shaking his head. "The boy's gone deaf. Must have been a fever or something in the night. Happened to a cousin of mine once. Woke up one morning and couldn't hear a whisper." He examined Samuel's ears, looked into his eyes, and finally shrugged. "He can still work. He's got eyes and hands. Put him on tasks where hearing doesn't matter, field work, hauling, that sort of thing." And just like that, Samuel had done it. He had transformed himself into someone the white people on the plantation would talk around freely, never considering that he might hear every word. But the performance had only just begun. Now came the hard part, maintaining it every moment of every day for however long it took to gather the information he needed and make his escape. The first weeks were the most dangerous. Samuel had to rewire every natural response, every instinctive reaction to sound. When someone dropped something behind him, he couldn't turn. When someone called his name, he couldn't respond. When arguments erupted in the quarters at night, he had to sleep through them or appear to wake only when someone shook him. Every moment was a test, and failure meant exposure, punishment, possibly death. But Samuel had always been patient, and now patience became his greatest asset. He learned to navigate the world through sight and touch and smell, to be aware of his surroundings without using sound as a primary sense. He learned to read lips well enough to understand basic conversations, which gave him an excuse to watch people's faces intently. And, most importantly, he learned to position himself where he could overhear, or rather, where he could hear while appearing not to, the most valuable conversations. The other enslaved people on the plantation were divided about Samuel's condition. Some, like Isaiah, were sympathetic, helping him navigate his new disability. Others were suspicious, wondering if he was faking, though none could figure out why someone would pretend such a thing. Samuel's isolation increased. It was harder to communicate with him, so people gradually included him less in conversations and activities. This isolation was painful, but it was also necessary. The fewer people who interacted with him regularly, the fewer opportunities there were for his disguise to slip. Months passed, and Samuel settled into his new identity. He was assigned to fieldwork primarily, tasks that required strength and endurance, but not complex communication. He hauled water, carried lumber, loaded wagons, worked the cotton fields during harvest. The work was backbreaking, but it had one significant advantage. It took him all over the plantation, to places and situations where Master Caldwell and the overseers spoke freely, never imagining the deaf slave nearby was absorbing every word. It was in the 4th month of his deception that Samuel first heard information that would prove valuable. He was working in the stable, mucking out stalls, when Master Caldwell and a neighboring plantation owner, George Henderson, stood just outside discussing business. Samuel continued his work, giving no sign that he was listening. "The railroad's getting more active," Henderson said, his voice worried. "I lost 3 niggers last month. Good workers, too. They just vanished in the night, and I know damn well they had help. There's conductors operating right here in the county, Richard. You need to be vigilant." The railroad. Samuel's heart raced, though his face remained impassive. He had heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and brave souls who helped enslaved people escape north to freedom. But he had never known concrete details, never known how to access it, never known who might be trustworthy. "Where do you think the access points are?" Caldwell asked, and Samuel's entire being focused on the answer that was coming. "There's a Quaker family about 15 miles north near the creek ford. The Johnsons. Word is they're sympathizers. And there's supposedly a free black man who works at the mill in town. Goes by the name of Freeman, isn't that ironic? Who passes information. But it's all rumors and suspicion. Can't prove anything without catching them in the act." Samuel filed away every detail. The Johnsons, 15 miles north, the creek ford, Freeman at the mill. These were pieces of a map, fragments of a path to freedom, and he was collecting them like precious stones, one by one, conversation by conversation. But information alone wasn't enough. Samuel needed money for the journey, needed supplies, needed to build physical strength for the difficult travel that would be required. He began to plan even more carefully, even more patiently. He volunteered for extra work, tasks that might earn him small privileges or tiny payments. Some slave owners allowed enslaved people to sell extra vegetables from small garden plots, or to do additional work for pennies. Caldwell was not generous, but he occasionally allowed such things, and Samuel took every opportunity. He also began to prepare himself mentally and spiritually for the journey ahead. At night, when he was sure no one was watching, he would practice moving silently through the dark, would test his own endurance by holding uncomfortable positions for long periods, would strengthen his resolve by remembering his mother's words. "They can chain your body, baby, but your mind is your own. Keep it free, and someday your body will follow." The 2nd year of his deception brought new challenges and new information. Master Caldwell's eldest daughter, Margaret, was courted by a young man from Virginia, and the wedding preparations brought numerous visitors to the plantation. Samuel, working as a server during these events, was present for countless conversations in which white people spoke freely about politics, about the growing tensions between North and South, about their fears of slave rebellions and abolitionist influence. He learned that some states in the North had outlawed slavery entirely. He learned that there were white people who believed slavery was morally wrong and actively worked to end it. He learned that escaped slaves who made it to Canada were beyond the reach of American slave catchers, truly free under British law. Each piece of information added to his growing understanding of the larger world beyond the plantation, a world he had only glimpsed in fragments before, but he also learned darker things. He heard Master Caldwell and his friends discuss brutal punishments for captured runaways, heard them laugh about slave catchers' dogs, heard them speak casually about separating families as punishment for disobedience. Every conversation reinforced Samuel's understanding that escape was not just desirable, but necessary, that every day in slavery was a day of dehumanization, that freedom was worth any risk. In the 3rd year, something unexpected happened. A new slave was purchased by Master Caldwell, a woman named Esther, who had been sold after her previous owner's death. Esther was 30 years old, dignified and quiet, with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. She was assigned to work in the kitchen, and Samuel, who sometimes brought water to the house, saw her regularly. Esther began to watch Samuel with an intensity that made him nervous. She seemed to study him, to observe his every movement and reaction. One evening, as he was leaving after delivering firewood, she approached him. She made gestures, pointing to her ears and then to him, asking a question he pretended not to understand. But her eyes were knowing, and Samuel felt a chill of fear. Did she suspect? Could she somehow tell? Days later, Esther caught him alone in the woodshed. She looked around carefully to ensure they were unobserved, then began to speak in a low voice, while making it appear she was simply giving him instructions about the wood. "I know you can hear me," she said quietly. "Don't react. Don't confirm it. Just listen. I'm not going to tell anyone. I think I understand why you're doing this. My husband did something similar on my last plantation, pretended to be simple-minded so they'd speak freely around him. It got him the information he needed to escape. I hope it does the same for you." Samuel's heart pounded. He kept his face blank, his eyes unfocused, but he was screaming inside. She knew. Someone knew his secret. But instead of fear, what he heard in her voice was respect, understanding, even encouragement. She wasn't going to expose him. She was telling him to continue. "If you're planning what I think you're planning," Esther continued, still speaking low, still appearing to give instructions about work, "there are things you should know. There's a woman in town who does laundry for white families. Her name is Ruth. She passes messages. If you ever get the chance to go to town, find a way to speak to her. She can help." Then Esther stepped back, made a gesture of dismissal, and walked away, leaving Samuel shaking. That night, Samuel lay awake for hours. The fact that Esther had guessed his secret was terrifying, but her decision to help rather than expose him was a reminder that he was not alone, that there were others who resisted, who fought back in their own ways, who supported each other's bids for freedom. Her husband had escaped. It was possible. It was real. From that day forward, Esther became Samuel's silent ally. They never spoke directly. Samuel maintained his deft disguise even around her, but she found ways to help him. She would position herself where she could overhear conversations and then find ways to communicate information to him through gestures and actions. She left a map she had drawn in a place where only he would find it. She made sure he got extra food when she could manage it, building his strength for the journey she knew he was planning. The 4th and 5th years passed in a strange suspension of time. Samuel continued his performance flawlessly, gathering more information, slowly accumulating the tiny resources he would need for escape. He learned the plantation's routine so thoroughly that he could navigate it blindfolded. Knew which overseer patrolled which section at which time, knew where the dogs were kept and how they were controlled, knew the locations of every fence, gate, and potential escape route. He also learned patience on a level he had never imagined possible. There were moments when he wanted desperately to drop the pretense, to speak, to hear his own voice in conversation rather than only in his own head. There were moments when isolation threatened to drive him mad, when he wondered if 7 years of pretending to be deaf was too high a price to pay, even for freedom. But then he would remember the alternative. A lifetime of slavery, of being property, of having no control over his own destiny, and he would find the strength to continue. In the 6th year, the opportunity Samuel had been waiting for finally came. Master Caldwell decided to send several enslaved workers to town to help with loading supplies, and Samuel was among them. The overseer who accompanied them was a new hire, younger and less vigilant than Clyde Morrison, who had grown old and tired. Samuel saw his chance to make contact with Ruth, the laundress Esther had told him about. While the others loaded the wagon, Samuel slipped away to the building where Ruth worked. He found her in the back, scrubbing clothes in large tubs. When she looked up and saw him, he put his finger to his lips, then pointed to his ears and shook his head. The gesture everyone knew meant he was deaf. But then he spoke, his voice rusty from years of disuse, barely a whisper. "Esther sent me. I need help to escape." Ruth's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. She glanced toward the door, then nodded. "Can you get away from the plantation at night?" she whispered back. Samuel nodded. 2 weeks from tonight, there will be no moon. Go to the creek ford, 15 miles north. Wade upstream for a mile to hide your scent. On the west bank, you'll see a barn with a red door. Hide in the hayloft. Someone will come for you the next night. Can you remember that? Samuel nodded again. Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Take this. There's food and a little money. Hide it well, and may God go with you." Samuel took the bundle, concealed it under his shirt, and slipped back to the wagon before his absence could be noticed. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, but his face remained impassive, his disguise intact. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Samuel's life. Every moment was torture, knowing freedom was so close, terrified something would go wrong, would prevent him from reaching that night with no moon. He prepared carefully, hiding the supplies Ruth had given him, along with the few items he had accumulated over 6 years. A knife he had found and repaired, a flint for starting fires, a spare shirt, a piece of canvas that could serve as a rain shelter. He also said goodbye, in his own silent way, to the people who had mattered. He looked at Isaiah one morning and hoped his friend could see the gratitude in his eyes for all the small kindnesses over the years. He left a small carving he had made in Esther's cabin, a bird in flight, so she would know he had succeeded and would remember him. He stood in the quarters one last time and thought of his mother, buried somewhere on this plantation in an unmarked grave, and promised her that he would live the free life she had dreamed for him. The night finally came, moonless and dark as promised. Samuel lay on his bed, waiting for the sounds of the plantation to settle into sleep. Around midnight, when he was certain the overseers had finished their rounds and everyone else was asleep, he rose silently and slipped out of the cabin. He had planned his route carefully, knew exactly how to avoid the areas where dogs were kept, where overseers might still be awake, where the shadows were deepest. He moved like smoke through the darkness, heading north toward the creek ford 15 miles away. He had walked countless miles during his years of enslavement, and his body was strong, but this journey was different. Every step was toward freedom, every mile was distance from bondage. He allowed himself to feel hope for the first time in 6 years, allowed himself to imagine a life where he controlled his own destiny, where his labor benefited himself, where he was a human being rather than property. The journey to the creek took him until dawn. He waded into the cold water and moved upstream, as Ruth had instructed, the water hiding his trail from any dogs that might be sent to track him. After a mile, he climbed onto the west bank and searched for the barn with the red door. He found it just as the sun was rising, slipped inside, and climbed into the hayloft. There, hidden in the sweet-smelling hay, Samuel finally allowed himself to rest. He slept fitfully through the day, waking at every sound, terrified of discovery. As darkness fell again, he heard voices below. His heart raced. Was it slave catchers? Had he been betrayed? But then a voice called softly, "Friend of a friend, if you're up there, you're safe. Come down, we need to move." Samuel climbed down and saw 2 figures, a white man of about 50 and a black woman perhaps a decade younger. The man extended his hand. "My name is Jacob Johnson. This is Harriet. We're going to get you north to the next station, but we need to move quickly. They'll have discovered you're missing by now and they'll be searching." Samuel shook Jacob's hand, and tears sprang to his eyes. After 6 years of silence, of pretending to be deaf, of gathering information and planning and preparing, he was actually doing it. He was actually escaping. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice still rough and uncertain. "Thank you." The journey north took 3 weeks, moving from safe house to safe house, always at night, always in danger. Samuel met dozens of people, black and white, who risked everything to help fugitive slaves reach freedom. He was hidden in root cellars and attics and false-bottomed wagons. He was fed and clothed and encouraged by people who asked nothing in return except that he keep moving, keep believing, keep fighting for his freedom. And finally, on a cool October morning in 1854, 7 years after he had begun his pretense of deafness, Samuel crossed into Canada. He stood on free soil for the first time in his life, and he wept. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs of relief and joy and grief for all the years lost, for his mother who had never known freedom, for all those still enslaved who might never make this journey. But Samuel did not simply settle into his new life and forget where he had come from. He understood that his freedom was built on the sacrifices of many people, and he felt obligated to help others achieve the same liberation. He found work in Toronto, established himself in the free black community there, and began to make trips back into the United States, working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad himself, helping others escape as he had been helped. He met Esther again, 3 years after his escape. She had made her own journey north, had found her own path to freedom, and when they encountered each other in a church in Toronto, they embraced like the old friends they were. "You did it," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "That crazy plan worked. You did it." "We did it," Samuel corrected. "I could never have done it alone." Samuel lived to see the end of slavery in the United States, lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory in the Civil War. He was 51 years old when slavery was abolished, and he celebrated with the thousands of other formerly enslaved people who had found freedom in Canada, who had built new lives, who had never given up hope that justice would eventually prevail. In his later years, Samuel told his story to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to understand the intelligence and strategic thinking that resistance to slavery required, the ways that enslaved people fought back using weapons of patience and deception and careful planning. They wanted us to believe we were less than human, less than intelligent, less than capable, he would say. But we knew the truth. We knew we were brilliant, were strategic, were determined. I pretended to be deaf for 7 years, and in those 7 years, I learned everything I needed to know to free myself. That wasn't luck. That was strategy. That was survival. That was us refusing to accept what they told us we were. Samuel's story spread through the community of formerly enslaved people, became part of the oral history passed down through generations. It was a story that emphasized not victimhood, but agency. Not suffering but resistance, not submission but strategic rebellion. It was a story that said we were always fighting back, always planning, always moving toward freedom, even when you couldn't see it, even when we appeared compliant and obedient, even when we hid our brilliance behind masks of simplicity. The strategy of pretending to be deaf was not unique to Samuel. As his story circulated, others came forward with similar tales. An enslaved woman who had pretended to be mute for 5 years to avoid forced sexual exploitation. A man who pretended to be intellectually disabled to avoid being sold away from his family, all while memorizing escape routes and gathering information. These stories revealed a hidden history of resistance, a testament to the creativity and intelligence of people who refused to be defined by their oppression. When Samuel died in 1891 at the age of 67, he was surrounded by children and grandchildren who had been born free, who would never know the auction block or the overseer's whip or the particular terror of being property. He had lived to see not just the end of slavery, but the beginning of what might be possible for black people in freedom. It was not the full justice he had hoped for. Racism and discrimination persisted, and the promise of true equality remained unfulfilled. But it was a beginning, and he had been part of making it happen. Samuel's final words to his family were about memory and resistance. Don't let them tell you we were passive. Don't let them tell you we simply endured. We fought back every day in ways big and small, in ways they could see and ways they couldn't. We protected our families, preserved our humanity, planned our freedom. We were brilliant and brave and strategic. Remember that. Teach your children that. Never forget what we were capable of, what we survived, what we built from nothing. The story of the enslaved man who pretended to be deaf for 7 years is more than just a tale of individual escape. It is a testament to the power of patience, of strategic thinking, of the human capacity to endure and resist, even in the most oppressive circumstances. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that sometimes the quietest acts are the most revolutionary, that survival itself can be a form of rebellion. It reminds us that enslaved people were not the simple, childlike beings their oppressors wanted to believe they were. They were complex, intelligent human beings who understood their situation with painful clarity and who used every tool at their disposal to fight against it. They were psychologists who understood how to manipulate their oppressors' expectations. They were strategists who planned years in advance. They were actors who maintained exhausting performances for months or years without breaking character. They were warriors who fought battles of patience and deception because those were the battles they could win. Samuel's 7 years of silence were 7 years of gathering weapons, information, knowledge, connections, resources. Every conversation he overheard, every detail he learned, every relationship he carefully cultivated was another tool in his eventual escape. His patience was not passivity but strategy. His silence was not submission but resistance. His performance of deafness was not deception for its own sake, but a calculated maneuver in a war for his own freedom. When we remember Samuel and others like him, we must remember the full scope of their resistance. We must acknowledge the psychological toll of maintaining such a disguise, the isolation it created, the constant fear of discovery. We must recognize the intelligence required to sustain such a performance for years without a single slip. We must honor the courage it took to bet everything on a plan that could fail in 100 different ways. And we must celebrate the brilliant success of people who freed themselves through wit and patience and strategic genius. The lesson of Samuel's story is not that enslaved people needed to be exceptionally clever to deserve freedom. Freedom is a human right, not something that must be earned through extraordinary acts. Rather, the lesson is that enslaved people were far more than their oppressors understood or acknowledged. They were fully human, with all the intelligence and creativity and strategic capacity that implies. The system of slavery required white people to believe black people were inferior, but the reality of resistance, of escape, of survival, of community building under impossible circumstances. All of this proves that belief was always a lie. Samuel's freedom was not given to him. He took it, carefully and patiently, over 7 long years of strategic silence. He claimed it for himself through intelligence and planning and courage. And in doing so, he joined the millions of enslaved people who resisted in ways large and small, who refused to accept their dehumanization, who fought for their freedom with every tool available to them. May we honor Samuel and all those who fought for freedom by telling their stories completely, by acknowledging their brilliant strategies of resistance, by recognizing them as the complex, intelligent, courageous human beings they were. May we teach our children that freedom has always required not just courage but intelligence, not just strength but strategy, not just resistance but patience. May we never reduce the enslaved to victims, but instead celebrate them as warriors who fought impossible battles and often won. Subscribe to keep these stories alive, to remember the genius of resistance, to ensure that the brilliance of people like Samuel is never forgotten or diminished. Their silence spoke volumes. Their patience changed history. Their freedom was earned through extraordinary acts of intelligence and courage that deserve to be remembered and honored forever.